Give me a little intro there, Gomer.
You're listening to the Station 71 podcast. My name is Mario, and this week I'm joined by my co-hosts,
Beth,
Brian,
Kirsten.
So we actually have a news topic this week, which is really weird considering last week we said we weren't going to do news. Disney has come out with a statement on what they're going to be doing going forward for Disney World and Disneyland annual pass holders in light of the whole COVID-19 thing. So let's talk a little bit about that. If you're an annual pass holder who's paid in full, as previously announced, Disney's going to be extending the annual pass the number of days that the parks are closed. So the new expiration date will be reflected on the annual pass holder's account prior to the reopening of the theme parks. We knew that. But the big thing that they were talking about on this one was the annual pass holder payment plans. So effective April 5th, 2020, they're going to stop and waive all upcoming payments while the theme parks are closed and retroactively refund the payments made between March 14th and April 4th. So at that point, they're then going to give you, from what I remember reading, the option to pay when they come back on and continue your monthly payments as you would if you were still be able to go. Or give you the chance to pay and then extend it through that time, which is a really cool option. And the fact that they're even doing that is super nice.
Yeah.
So
there's also something about like annual pass holders that had paid in full. They're going to give the option to like refund part of it.
There's a thing on here that says Disneyland, if you're an annual pass holder who has paid in full, as previously announced, all active Disneyland Resort annual pass holders who have paid for their passports in full will automatically have their passport expiration date extended through the theme park closures to provide additional access opportunities at the end of the passport term. Alternatively, in lieu of an extension of their passports, pass holders who have paid in full may choose to receive a partial refund for the theme park closure period. I don't see that for Disney World, but I could be wrong.
If you scroll down under Walt Disney World, it does say.
Oh, okay.
If you're
yeah, I see that now.
But I'm not exactly sure how that's gonna work. Because I mean, I guess it would be like a prorated amount.
Probably.
Like whatever amount you weren't able to go, they would refund.
That would make
That
would make the most sense. I know they were also offering like free dining for guests that had their trips canceled when they first announced the closure too. So like they're really trying to do everything they can, and it's good to see that. You know,
they also, if I'm not mistaken, if you're an annual pass holder that had to cancel a trip, like you wouldn't have had a package because you wouldn't have bought tickets, obviously. And they were allowing you to apply the value of the free dining that they were offering to everybody else to your next annual pass.
Oh, wow.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
I didn't see that, and I'm actually going to be affected by that. So that's cool.
Yeah. So they're working real hard to try and keep good face with pass holders and guests whose trips were affected.
I will say, I think on the whole, at least so far with this situation, Disney's been doing a very good job of how they've handled things.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, we've definitely given them a lot of flack before for not handling things right, but this is like the time that they are doing the right thing. They're doing it in a way that it makes sense, and I'm very happy with how it's being handled.
Mm-hmm. Same here.
Yeah.
So, anything that you guys want to talk about before we roll right into the episode? It feels so weird to be doing that.
The short news. I'm barely warmed up.
I guess we have this one housekeeping thing on here that we can kind of start with. Our topic this week, we're going to be starting what may be a series on Imagineers and how their projects have affected the parks. I don't know if this is going to end up being like our World Showcase in depth where we just roll through a whole bunch of them, or if we're going to do this like this episode and then a couple.
I think we'll have to take some breaks in between.
Probably.
Yeah.
These are real content heavy here.
Yeah, but
And especially with this first one, I was going to say, yeah, we discussed doing this series of episode on, the series on the different Imagineers. And I think it was Beth that suggested, well, we have to start with Walt, right? Because he's, the OG Imagineer. But originally, this episode was going to be like a single episode where we would touch on some bullet points. And I kind of felt like that was going to make this more like just reading a list of bullet points. And I always kind of try to at least have a story going with the history episodes. So this is definitely going to be multiple episodes. And yeah, I want to know what you guys think. And hopefully listeners will give us some feedback too about if we want to kind of, roll through these or kind of stagger and release this in waves or episodes here and there.
I do also feel like this is something we've kind of shied away from for a very long time. So
Yes.
yeah, this is going to be fun to actually sit down and talk about.
For sure.
So I guess that said, I'm going to pass it over to you, Brian.
Okay, here we go. Yeah, this is probably the most ambitious undertaking I've taken so far with the podcast. So, but it's been a lot of fun so far, and I'm ready to dive into it. Like, this is the big one, right? We have to do a Walt biography, and what better time than now? I feel like most people have a lot more free time right now, so I know I do. So, yeah, I'm able to go heavy on the research. So, all right, ready to roll into it?
Ready as I'll ever be.
Alrighty, so while Marceline, Missouri may have very well been what Walt considered his hometown, he was neither born there nor spent many years as a resident, in fact. Our story will begin in a much different setting, 1249 Tripp Avenue, Chicago, Illinois. Here on December 5th, 1901, Flora Disney gave birth to her and her husband Elias's fourth and youngest son. Flora was pregnant at the same time as their preacher, Walter Parr's wife, and Elias and Walter had made an agreement that if their wives both had sons, that each would name them after the other. And so, in the bedroom of a small Chicago home, Walt Disney came into the world. And I know the Disney historians have kind of gone back and forth on this and said that this may have been kind of an exaggeration with the story, but I thought it fit as a really good opening, so I chose to throw it in there.
Yeah, that's a cute idea.
Work had brought Elias and the Disney family to Chicago 11 years prior. With the upcoming 1983 World's Fair, Elias sought employment as a carpenter and helped build many of the exposition stages. Earning a meager $1 a day, Elias found it difficult to support Flora and their two sons, Herbert and Ray, and they soon found out that they had another son, Roy, on the way. Elias's brother Robert had become quite successful in Chicago some years prior, dabbling in the gold, oil, and real estate business. With his help, Elias was able to purchase a plot of land to build a larger house for his growing family, as well as a number of others. Elias began constructing small cottages on these properties, and through selling and renting them, was able to pull in far more income than he had as a carpenter working on the World's Fair. This was perhaps the only time when Elias would find financial success. Though Elias was hardworking and determined to continue his success, he was a family man at heart. He saw their Chicago neighborhood become rougher and feared that his boys might get pulled into the rising crime of a growing Chicago. When two boys the same age as Herbert and Ray, who attended the same church as the Disneys, were arrested after attempting to steal a car and ultimately killing a police officer in the ensuing shootout, it was the final push that Elias needed to move. Once again, Elias looked to follow in his brother Robert's footsteps. Robert had purchased farmland in Missouri as an investment property. Elias took a few trips out to the area and thought it was just what the family needed, a quiet, rural farm town in stark contrast to the streets of Chicago. In February of 1906, after selling all of his investment properties, Elias, Herbert, and Ray set out on a boxcar for Marceline to prepare the new farm, with Flora, the new baby Ruth, and 4-year-old Walt following on the Santa Fe train shortly after. So this brings us to what will probably be the biggest and most important part of this story. To quote Walt, "More things of importance have happened to me and Marceline than have happened since, or are likely to in the future." The town of 4,500 residents served as an inspiration for a number of Walt's future works. Perhaps most notably was Kansas Avenue, the main thoroughfare of Marceline. The street was lined with a number of businesses, including a dry goods store, a creamery, and a jewelry store. It was picturesque and, according to Walt, exactly the way a small town should look. The Disney's 45-acre farm was a sprawling frontier compared to the family's home in Chicago. The property had rows of fruit orchards, forests, ponds, and a variety of wild animals. It was just heaven for city kids, Roy recalled. Walt spent many days fishing in the pond and exploring the woods on the property when not helping with farm duties. However, even more enchanting than the appearance of Marceline was the sense of community that Walt observed there. Farmers working together through issues, women gathering to cook for the community. Walt even noted that in the early 1900s, race relations were much more progressive in Marceline than elsewhere in the country. It was this feeling of togetherness and community that Walt would try to emulate many years later. Though the appearance and community of Marceline had a profound impact on Walt, many more specific occurrences would help shape the young boy's future. Walt recalled using all the money he had saved in a piggy bank to see a traveling theater perform Peter Pan when they came to Marceline. Seeing the play even inspired Walt to play the character in a school production. "No actor ever identified himself with the part he was playing more than I," he said. Walt saw his first motion picture, first circus, and even Buffalo Bill's Wild West show all during his time in Marceline. And I love that fact that, he was so enthralled by seeing Peter Pan in a traveling show. Like, how many more times did that come back throughout Disney history?
Yeah. It's stuff like that is really fascinating about, like, how many of these little things are just, you're going to see them circle back around at some point.
Mm-hmm. So true. Walt's relationship with his extended family was also its strongest during the years he spent in Marceline. Because it was located on the railroad line, the family was frequently visited by Walt's uncle Mike Martin, an engineer on the Marceline-Fort Madison line. Walt would call him one of the prides of my life, no doubt helping to inspire his love of trains. The family was also often visited by Elias's younger brother Ed, who was intellectually disabled. Walt marveled at his free spirit and lack of inhibitions. Though he lived with Elias's sisters, he frequently would take random solo trips on the railroad to show up to the Marceline farm unannounced. While there, he and Walt would stroll through the woods where Ed would identify various plants and birds to Walt, furthering the boy's love of nature and Marceline itself. Walt would later say of Ed did everything he wanted. He was a real-life Peter Pan. To me, he represented fun in its simplest and purest forms. However, the family member that may have had the most profound, albeit inadvertent, impact on Walt's future was his Aunt Margaret, Robert's wife. When the two stopped by Elias's farm, she would often bring small presents for the children, and on one such occasion, Walt was gifted a Big Chief drawing tablet and pencils. Even as a child, Walt felt a sense of importance to his drawings. And Marceline was a retired doctor, Doc Sherwood, who Walt would oftentimes visit with throughout the day and showed the drawings he had made. Doc and his wife were always encouraging to Walt and his budding artistic talents. On one occasion, Doc convinced Walt to draw a picture of his horse Rupert. Once finished, Walt considered his results pretty terrible, but Doc Sherwood gave Walt a nickel for it and framed the picture and hung it in his house. Roy Disney would later refer to this moment, jokingly yet not entirely untruthfully, as the highlight of Walt's life. And this is very true, and you'll see a lot that Walt didn't necessarily get a lot of encouragement from his immediate family on his artistic abilities, and when somebody outside of his family showed him encouragement or made him proud of his drawings, he really held on to that for a long time.
That's so awesome.
Could you imagine how much that drawing would be worth today?
Oh my
gosh.
There's no telling. I mean, there's really no telling.
Mm-hmm.
like on a free market where some crazy Disney fan like us could bid on it, you know?
For a crazy Disney fan with money.
Yeah, that's
Yes.
the big deciding factor there.
Oh, man. However, not all of Walt's artistic creations were met with approval. One day, as he and Ruth were walking around the farm, Walt noticed the tar lining in a rain barrel. Walt remarked that it could be used as a temporary paint, though Ruth had concerns over that descriptor. After the two were done adorning the side of their whitewashed house, they realized with dismay that the tar had a permanence not unlike that of actual paint. Needless to say, Elias and Flora were not amused, and even 30 years after the incident, Flora was quoted as saying Walt was old enough to have known better. The story goes that by the time the Disneys left Missouri, the tar paintings were still on the side of the house.
Oh, goodness.
Now, how much would that house be worth nowadays, do you think, if you would be able to find
Honestly,
pictures he did on that?
who knows? Because it's one of those things that it's like, if it was today's housing market trying to explain that there was tar on the side of the house, that sounds like such a far-fetched thing. Like,
That's probably true. Though Elias was undoubtedly hardworking, he was equally as stubborn. Farming was not as prosperous as endeavor as he may have hoped, due both to his ignorance and hard-headedness. Initially, he refused to fertilize his crops, likening it to giving whiskey to a man. He felt better for a little while, but then he was worse off than before. As one would imagine, his crops performed poorly, and he finally gave up and fertilized his fields. The apples and popping corn that the Disneys grew did bring in some income, but Elias found himself having to supplement it with carpentry work. And for all the good things, you know, that Walt remembers during Marceline, it's like, you know, it's interesting to keep in mind that this was one of the lowest points for Elias, because he was wanting, he had these big aspirations of, you know, moving out to the country and giving his family this, you know, better life that he really wanted for them. But he was really struggling the whole time in order to really make it work with, you know, a career in farming that he had really no idea about.
yeah, it's weird to see the two separate ends of that spectrum.
The biggest blow to the Disney's family stability in Marceline came in 1907. Herbert and Ray had set up a deal with their Uncle Robert to grow wheat on his land and then pay their neighbors to harvest it for him. After earning their money independently, they were asked by the father how they intended to spend it. After listing such extravagances as a pocket watch, Elias exploded and told them that he would be taking their money to help pay off the farm. With that, the two withdrew their money that day and left for Kansas City to work as bank tellers. The combination of Herbert and Ray leaving, falling crop prices over the following years, and Elias's health and age presenting problems, the farm was no longer able to support the Disney family. And here's another theme that you will see throughout this history, is that Elias was very tight-fisted with his money, and he was also very tight-fisted with any of the boys' money that they made. And even though he struggled so often, he always thought that he knew better than them as to how they should spend, invest, or save their money, and it caused a lot of problems over the years.
It's funny, you can almost see the effects of that in each, Walt and Roy, because one became very meticulous about spending, and the other was like, spend it all on my dreams.
It is very true. It's interesting to see that. You know, you're right. It's like they had very similar experiences, but it shaped them in very different ways. So after only 5 years in Marceline, Elias sold his livestock and the farm to move to a small house in Kansas City. It was a crushing blow to Walt and Roy. This town and their home had been an idyllic land compared to the Chicago before. Here, Walt's love of animals, trains, theater, and art had all blossomed. The aesthetics and escapism that Marceline had provided was something that Walt would carry with him into many of his later works.
Bringing it all back around, like we said before, it's funny that you can see the effects of that in his work later.
You know, and so much of it. I mean, obviously, like, you know, the main street in Marceline served as his, you know, at least a starting point for Main Street USA. But even more than that, like, you know, the research I've done talks about how much, you know, he connected with this like, you know, Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn type, being able to just go around and explore the forest and all and the lands and everything in Marceline. And, you know, it not just the aesthetics, like it connected with him on such an emotional level that, you know, it shaped so much stuff. So moving on to Kansas City and a very different setting and a something that would shape Walt in a very different way. Kansas City was a letdown for the Disney family in multiple ways. The crowded city offered none of the small town charm of Marceline. The house was cramped for the family of 5, and perhaps most of all, Elias's new job was not one he was particularly proud of. He sold the Marceline farm for $5,175 and used nearly $2,000 of that money to purchase a 650 customer paper route for the Kansas City Star. Elias chose to list Roy as the owner of the route.
That's a very strange statement to hear.
Yes. I guess he wasn't particularly proud of having his name on it. Some people say it was that. Other people say that apparently the Kansas City Star was actually kind of choosy about who it had delivering their papers, and because Elias was getting kind of old at this time, they worried that he might not be able to keep up with the route, so having 18-year-old Roy sign his name on it, they actually had a better chance of getting the route. So
okay, I can kind of see that.
The route provided customers a morning and evening edition Monday through Saturday and one edition on Sunday. In order to meet the needs, Elias divided the route amongst himself, Roy, and Walt. Delivering the paper was quite a daunting task. Elias refused to purchase a horse and wagon like most of the other deliverers used. Instead, they used push carts. At 3:30 in the morning, the three would pick up their first load of paper and distribute to the customers. 9-year-old Walt would return home around 5:30 to 6, take a short nap, eat breakfast, and then go to school. Each day, though, Walt would have to leave school early to prepare for the nightly deliveries. Each week, the paper netted the Disney's $34, of which Elias kept 31, Roy got 3, and Walt received nothing. So, yeah, it's hard to dig too much into the Disney history and not paint Elias in a bad picture, but he did a lot of stuff like this. I mean, like, obviously, one, this is bad because he's having Walt essentially be an unpaid laborer for him. But also, you know, he's very clearly not as concerned with Walt's education as he is making money. And you'll definitely see that through. Elias had much more focus on money making than education.
That's it's so weird because you said that and I was kind of thinking it but didn't want to say it. Like, I never really realized how Walt's childhood was from like that aspect.
Yeah, I mean, it is. It's kind of rough, you know, and especially at this, you know, kind of formative time of his life. You know, he's like, he goes from, you know, being a very small child in Marceline to having this awesome kind of just like, not completely carefree, you know, he's still having to do some work on the farm, but, you know, he's getting to go out, explore, has like free roam all the time to go do fun stuff. And then when they moved to Kansas City, it's like a complete 180 flip. You know, it's like now he's living in a small, cramped city. And instead of all this freedom, he has this extremely strict schedule that he has to stay on, you know, like all the time. And, you know, not only would this be bad on its own, but having to flip from one to the other like that as a 9-year-old, that's, you know, it's going to have an impact.
Kind of reminds me of like Michael Jackson in that he had a really awful father, which I don't know if Elias was as bad as Joe Jackson, but and
don't
he
think
like
quite
didn't
that
get to
bad,
have
but-
he like didn't have a childhood because he was just like forced to work all the time. And so like when he grew up, he just had this, and obviously it manifested in totally different ways, but just like the obsession with childhood, and wanting to be able to play and be a kid and like having this magical view of like innocence.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
No,
As
I mean,
weirdly as this sounds,
I think
I
that's
don't
very
think that it
likely.
actually manifested that differently. And like it sounds very similar to what you're explaining. Like there is this fascination with like never growing up and the whole Peter Pan relation. Like that's a really good point.
I think, and it'll actually really tie into this next section actually really well, but yeah, I think in a lot of ways, like what kind of Elias bestowed onto Roy and Walt was like this sense that they were going to have to kind of fight for themselves to make it in the world. And it did kind of manifest itself in different ways, whereas Roy was like very money conscious, but in another way, Walt was like, doing everything he could to make it for himself. So it's kind of like two sides of the same coin almost.
Yeah, definitely.
Walt was also in charge of collecting the dues on Saturday and redelivering any papers on the route that had gone missing. When Roy graduated high school, he left the paper route to work as a bank teller, which caused Elias to hire some neighborhood boys to fill the vacancy. Unfortunately, they often missed deliveries, causing even more work for Walt. In order to supplement the $0 a week he was earning, Walt found ways to use the paper route to his advantage. He would deliver medicine for the local pharmacy to customers along his route. Walt would then take that money to purchase 50 additional papers to sell to passerbys on the corner of the trolley. He'd even work at a local candy store during his school recess. The route was also not as profitable as Elias had thought, and he also had to look for other areas of income. He had the creamery in Marceline shipping butter and eggs to sell along the route. Though with Elias getting on in age, he frequently became ill and would require Walt to stay home from school to make the deliveries. Again, focusing much more on his money than Walt's education.
Yeah, dang. Poor Walt.
I know. I feel very bad for him at this point. In the 6 years that Walt worked for the paper route, he only missed 5 weeks of work. 2 when he came down with a severe cold, 2 more when he injured his foot, and 1 on a trip to see his Aunt Josie in Hiawatha in 1913. Though many would be bitter at the things they missed out on while having to work the route, Walt looked at it as an opportunity for improvement. The upshot of it was I was working all the time, he said. I mean, I never really had any real playtime. I developed an appreciation for what spare time I did have and used it to great advantage in my hobbies. Which I think is just very cool because I can tell you if I had had that same experience, I would have a very bitter and negative outlook on the whole thing.
Yeah, I could see myself doing that as well.
Plus, like, what kid really wants to be working all the time?
Walt made friends with one of his classmates named Walt Pfeiffer. Coincidentally, their family ended up moving to the same block as the Disneys, furthering the boys' friendship. The Pfeiffer's household was much more lively and spontaneous than that of the Disneys, and Walt found himself longing for that type of setting. Because of the paper route, Walt was ordered to bed at 9 o'clock, but oftentimes he would sneak out and go over to the Pfeiffers to play games, sing songs, and even act out comedy sketches. In an interview later in his life, Walt Disney said, "I went to bed tired, but knowing that the past hour and a half had been the nicest part of the day."
Aw.
I know,
This is
that one's kind of
really
sad,
sad.
but the two Walts shared not only a name, but an aptitude for showmanship. With the help of Mrs. Pfeiffer, they began writing and rehearsing comedy sketches and performing in local talent shows, which Walt Disney had to sneak out to attend in order to keep it from Elias. The two performed original sketches to begin with, but soon became obsessed with the acting of Charlie Chaplin. Walt and Walt would watch all of Chaplin's films multiple times in order to study the performances. Then they began doing impersonations of Chaplin at talent shows, with Disney playing Charlie and Pfeiffer playing the Count, his nemesis. Walt loved the applause and began considering acting as a future career. Walt was not always able to go to the Pfeiffers, though, and to escape the monotony of his daily life, he often turned back to drawing. In particular, he drew at school almost constantly. Elias had never placed much focus on Walt's education, and in turn, Walt placed little of his own attention to it. He spent most of his days in class drawing in the margins of his textbook. His teachers would describe him as sleepy and preoccupied. However, many began taking notice of his talents and began commissioning work from him. One of his teachers had him design posters for school, which eventually led to him making advertisements for a local theater. Walt even began exchanging drawings for haircuts at his barber, and eventually just selling the drawings to the barber to display in his window. Elias, showing some interest in Walt's passion, even allowed him to take art classes at the Kansas City Art Institute, taught at his local YMCA when he turned 14.
So nice of him to finally show interest in his son's talent.
I know,
Right.
yeah, 14, after he's been doing this for quite some time. Yeah, but not to speak too good of Elias, because
boy.
the next part.
Great.
Elias was discovering that the paper route would never bring him the success that his brother Robert had found, and in his 50s, he was running out of time to make his mark on the world. During his time in Kansas City, he began investing in a jelly and fruit juice company named Ozell that was based out of Chicago. In March of 1917, he finally sold the paper route for $16,000 and invested even more heavily in Ozell. He and Flora moved back to Chicago and began working in construction and maintenance at the company's factory. Walt, however, stayed in Kansas City with his brother Herbert, finally free of his paper route duties.
Finally.
Yes, unfortunately, this won't last too terribly long, but Walt found a job selling candy, soda, and other refreshments on the Santa Fe train route. He loved just getting to be on the train and would even bribe the engineers with items he was selling in order to see the inside of the coal car. The job also gave Walt a chance to see more of the country and a way out of the cramped Kansas City home. In fact, I didn't put this in here, but I will say Herbert actually purchased the same house that Elias and the rest of the family were living in after they moved away. So Walt didn't even really get a change of scenery after Elias and Flora moved. Yeah. This would not last long, though. World War I began and Roy was called to service. Walt decided to move back with his parents in Chicago. Though Kansas City was a major come down for Marceline in a number of ways, it was here that Walt was able to discover two of his main passions, drawing and theater. It's very interesting to me, this point in Walt's life, and just how, I don't know, it's weird for me to see someone kind of like go through this and come out as like bright-eyed and optimistic as he did, just at life in general.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking that when you were talking. I was like, it's for everything that's happened at this point, it's kind of funny, like knowing the person that Walt Disney becomes.
Yeah, right. I mean, like, you would look at most people and maybe just say, like, okay, this was the early 1900s. It wasn't exactly a great time in history, like, with all the stuff people were going through. And, you know, if this was just some random person, you're just like, oh, yeah, that was life back then. But when you look at it knowing, yeah, this person became, like, the Walt Disney that everyone knows, that went through that and still came out like he did, it's, you know, it's interesting. Over the years in Kansas City, Elias had bought thousands of dollars of Ozell shares, even pulling money out of Walt's saving to purchase more.
Wow.
Yeah, that hurts. I think more surprising is the fact that Elias even put any money into savings for Walt. So, upon moving to Chicago to work for the company, he agreed to invest another $3,000 with them on the condition that Walt would receive a job on his arrival. Though Walt arrived at the end of summer in 1917 and started school instead. So
There he is, trying to make his son work again.
You know, that's the thing. Like, he roped Walt into almost, I mean, seriously, for his entire childhood, you know, Elias decided, I want to go farm. So he made Walt farm. Then he decided he wanted to run a paper route. He made Walt run the paper route. Then he decided he wants to go make fruit juices and jellies. And he gets Walt a job doing that too. It's like everything he did, he roped his entire family into.
Well, I mean, I guess it's also like a very obviously different time then, and like people had kids to have workers, as awful as that sounds.
That's true. You know, I should probably note that, you know, I am looking at all of this through the lens of a 27-year-old millennial, you know? So it's like, maybe that's how everybody was back then.
I mean, it's just like, you know, different generations, like how our grandparents or parents or whatever are like, you should just walk in and ask for a job. Like, okay, thank you.
That's how it works.
So helpful.
I mean,
Appreciate the advice there.
that's definitely like very, very true of this, because it's like you were saying, it's crazy to look back and be like, wow, he really did just drag him everywhere. But then you got to figure like almost everybody in this time was coming out of that period where like your family worked entirely wherever you were working.
And this was also during the Depression, you know, so it's not like
that's
there were a ton
true.
of opportunities.
Sorry to change the entire perspective of your work, Brian.
Oh, no. I mean, for sure, please stop me if you have stuff to say, because I'll just continue reading and it'll be just like my opinion or outlook on this whole thing. So, just like in Kansas City, Walt spent more time focused on his drawings and his classwork and quickly became known as the artist of the school. Walt began drawing political cartoons for the school paper, The Voice. Art was quickly becoming the main focus of his life, and he would even skip school to visit the Chicago Institute of Art or even visit Chicago's newspaper offices to observe their illustrators. By the winter, Walt even convinced Elias to let him take art classes at the Chicago Academy of Fine Arts. While there, he quickly discovered that he would never be a fine artist, but he did have a talent for caricature and cartoons.
And then it began.
You know, I find it funny, just, I'm sure we'll get into this later, but, you know, I know when Walt was starting Cal Arts, this will obviously come up in a later episode, but, you know, I remember watching a thing and he was saying that, you know, he wanted to take, or he thought about teaching a class there after he started the school. Now, obviously, this is after, like, Disney had blown up and everything. And I remember they said that, like, all of the other animators reacted like, oh, God. Like, at that point in time, you know, Walt wasn't known for his artistic abilities, and a lot of the illustrators that he hired on were way better than him. And he was like, I'm not talking about doing art classes. I would teach storytelling or something like that, you know? So it's just funny to me how that changed. Like, Walt was a good artist, but, you know, his talents really lied more in what he was able to do with the art as far as storytelling than the art itself. And this was like the first kind of place where that showed up.
Imagine being so comfortable with Walt, you were like, yeah, you really should not teach an animation class, man. Like,
Though Walt's artistic talents were developing, he thought becoming a cartoonist for a paper would be challenging and didn't want to give up on his other passion, acting. Walt made friends with a fellow classmate named Russell Moss, and the two began working on a comedy act to perform at local theaters. However, after getting kicked off stage during a tryout at one of the theaters, Walt more or less gave up on acting at that point in his life.
Well, and there goes that.
Yeah. And perhaps even more disappointingly to follow that up, after school let out for the summer of 1918, Walt began working at Ozell, crushing apples, canning jellies, and even working as the night watchman from time to time. Unsurprisingly, yeah, obviously, did not have much of a choice. Unsurprisingly, the job didn't interest Walt much, and in July, he left to work as a mail carrier for the Chicago Post Office. By the end of the summer, Walt found himself at a crossroad. He didn't intend to return to school, and the job he was working at weren't ones he was passionate about. Like many other young men at the time, Walt wished to join the military and fight in the Great War. However, at 16, he was too young to enlist, but that didn't stop he and Russell Moss from trying anyways. The two tried to join the U.S. Navy and rejected due to their age, so they attempted to sign up for the Canadian forces. Unfortunately, Moss had very poor eyesight and was rejected, and Walt didn't want to go without him.
They're like, must be extra illegal. Not only are we underage, let's try and sign up for a country that we aren't citizens of.
Though eventually the two found out that the Red Cross Ambulance Corps took on those as young as 17, and even though they were both 16 at the time, they figured they had a better shot at it than the military. After finally convincing his mother to sign the necessary papers, Walt forged his birth date as December 5th, 1900, and enlisted on September 16th. Walt and Russell were sent to a facility on Chicago's South Side for 4 weeks of training. Unfortunately, during his time there, he contracted influenza and had to be sent home to recover. So his company, unfortunately, the original company he was in, left while he was home with influenza. So he returned to the camp on November 4th and then was sent to another facility in Connecticut to await deployment. While in Connecticut, though, the armistice was signed, ending the war. And Walt was distraught and felt like he had missed out on his chance to be a part of history. However, he soon found that his company was being sent to France to aid in the occupation. On November 30th, his boat arrived in Le Havre, where he boarded a train to Paris to begin work. While there, Walt actually spent very little time driving an ambulance. Most of his duties involved chauffeuring military and Red Cross officials, as well as delivering for the canteen. During this time, Walt's charisma made an impact, and soon dignitaries began requesting him specifically to be their driver.
Wow, he bougie.
But it kind of comes through in a lot of ways. Like, Walt made the best out of pretty much any situation he could. And kind of same here, instead of having to drive like wounded soldiers and deal with all that mess, he realized he had enough charisma to be a chauffeur driver for people instead.
Right.
With the free time he found, Walt turned again to drawing. He drew menus for the canteen, caricatures for fellow enlistees to send home, and even began sending editorial cartoons to magazines back in America, though all of his works were rejected.
Womp womp.
Yes. Eventually, he found some success in a slightly different area. He and another boy in the barracks found a number of German helmets in a dump outside of town. Walt painted the helmets camouflage, and the other boy would scuff them up and even shoot some of them, and then sell them as authentic war memorabilia.
Wow. Oh my gosh. Little swindler.
I know. Which, from the sources that I read, said that it was mainly the other guy doing this, and he was just going to Walt to have him paint the camouflage on, and the other boy was taking care of the rest, and they just kind of cut Walt some money at the end of it. But I'm pretty sure he knew what was going on at the time.
I mean, what else would he think was being done with them?
Though Walt enjoyed his time in France, he was becoming homesick. In August of 1919, he applied for a discharge and a little over 2 months later returned home. While serving in the Red Cross, Walt had been sending most of his money back home. When he returned, he told Elias he planned on withdrawing his money and trying to start a career as an artist. Unsurprisingly, Elias resisted.
I was waiting for that part.
Yeah, it's coming. Elias had secured another job for Walt at Ozell and couldn't see why he would give all that up for any other aspirations. Walt was not deterred, though. Now, 17, he found himself with a clear, albeit uncertain path laid out before him. He was to be a cartoonist. All he had to do now was find someone to hire him.
And so it begins.
So yes, as you can see, what was once supposed to be a single episode of the entirety of Walt's biography turned into him from 1 to 17. So might take us a couple episodes to get through all this, but I'm pretty excited about it, and it's something that I've kind of had in the back of my mind for a while, and I'm really glad that we're doing it.
It's one of those things that, like, we're going to do this the right way, so it deserves more than one episode.
Yes.
Yeah.
So before we wrap this up, do we want to talk about this little news thing that I have that I threw in there?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. This is going to be very, very unconventional for us to throw in news at the very end of the episode, but we kind of privately talked about this for a little bit, and then something came up while we were recording that I wanted to mention. As we've been putting off news for the whole COVID-19 thing, Disney announced that some of their executives, well, let me back that up. Disney executives were receiving pay cuts due to the closures. What they were planning on doing was they were cutting the salaries of higher ups to alleviate some of the costs and hopefully help pay some of their cast members through this time. The breakdown was as follows. Bob Iger was going to forego his entire salary. Bob Chapek was going to take a 50% pay cut. Executive vice presidents were going to receive a 30%, senior vice presidents 25%, and vice presidents would receive a 20% pay cut. So from what I have gathered through reading all of this, that doesn't include bonuses and anything else that they would be getting paid out, which is seemingly why some of these people are mad about it.
So that's really disappointing because for most executives like C-levels, I mean, most of their compensation comes from their bonus. I thought when I first read it that it was including any compensation for the year, which I was actually impressed with, but never mind.
So this second article that I shared in here is it says Disney execs upset about their own pay cuts. And it looks like the article about halfway down actually touches on that, Kirsten. Note that the bulk of Iger and Chapek's compensation will remain untouched because of cuts only applied to their base salary. In the case of Chapek, his base is $2.5 million, but his annual target bonus is $7.5 million, and his annual long-term incentive is grant $15 million. Likewise, Iger's base salary in the most recent fiscal year was $3 million, but he earned $44.5 million in additional compensation, which would remain intact. Iger's additional compensation is largely based on the company's performance and likely will not match that figure this year. And if filing with the Sanctuaries and Exchange Commission, Disney also noted that Mr. Iger is also waiving his right to receive his car allowance payable during the same period the salary waiver is in effect.
Oh, how will he manage?
That gesture didn't go unnoticed by some whose total compensation is in line with the cost of a luxury vehicle. So the thing about this is that's really funny. The last two paragraphs on here, before the very, very end, say sources say that the amended contracts are pretty much voluntary. However, the expectation is for executives to sign. If an executive doesn't sign, he or she is taking a risk with regard to future career mobility within the studio and the prospect of potential bonuses. So basically, this is voluntary but not voluntary. It's
The illusion
it's so
of choice.
bizarre how like this second article came out and like totally flipped my mind on this.
Yeah, I know.
Literally exactly what Kirsten said. I was like, wow, this is really impressive. I'm actually like, all right, maybe Iger's not that bad of a guy, and he's given up his whole salary. And then reading that, I was like, oh, no, he's not. He's given up the weak part of his salary.
And I highly doubt he's the one pushing back. Like, honestly, I can kind of understand somebody who makes $150 a year, depending on where they live. Like, if they're the only earner in their household and they live in Anaheim, like $150,000 is really not that much.
Well, the
for
perspective
that
of the
cost of living.
Yeah, that's probably true.
the perspective of this article actually seems like a lot of the people that are pushing back are the people under Iger and Chapek.
Which, like, what do you expect?
Right.
I mean, but I do wonder, like, are they just taking pay cuts to save money, or are they actually using those pay cuts to help pay other employees longer?
Well, the way this
Because
is
I haven't
worded,
read
the
anything
fact-
about that.
It's going directly to the shareholders.
yeah.
Oh, for sure. Like
At least some of it. It's like, please, our stocks are falling.
Well, the other thing that we had learned recently too was the about how their cast members are being handled with this, how they're being paid through the 18th, I think it was, and then they're holding back saying anything else because they're working on changing the contract. Was that what it was?
Yeah, but they actually did update that.
Oh boy, what did I miss?
That they will Disney employees, like hourly and like any non-essentials, will be furloughed. So they're not going to be getting paid directly from Disney, from what I understand. Although all of their other benefits will remain in place, they'll still get the like health insurance through Disney. Like Disney will still pay their part of the health insurance. And if anybody wants to use any like vacation time or sick time that they have during that to like, I don't know, be their salary for the time being, they are allowed to do that. And that they can still file for like unemployment and get that, but that they're not going to be getting their regular salary, if I recall correctly.
That makes sense because that's how a lot of places are handling this. A lot of people are being furloughed just so that they can get their benefits and they can hold on to like the that side of it, but they can still file for unemployment in the case that they need their compensation.
Yeah, I just found the article. I can link to that real quick if you guys want to have it on
Yeah, we can.
the screen. But yeah, any non-union employees or employees whose roles and projects are not essential to maintaining operations will be furloughed. They'll receive full health care benefits, with Disney paying the cost of the employee and company premiums, and will also be able to continue with their Disney Aspire education programs, and will be eligible for $600 a week in federal compensation through the $2 trillion economic stimulus bill that just passed.
Okay, so basically the same way that most places are handling this.
Yeah, pretty much.
Oh boy. Well, I don't know. I'm happy that people are taking pay cuts in light of this. I just wish it was going to the bottom tier, but what can you do?
Yeah.
What can
At
you
least
do?
they've gotten paid this long and will get paid for the next few weeks.
That's true.
I know a lot of companies have not given their employees that luxury.
A lot of places before, I think I mentioned this when we were talking about it on the live show, a lot of places are doing 2-week basis where it's like they'll pay you, or they'll say, okay, 2 weeks we're going to come back to work, 2 weeks we're going to come back to work. But now that they're saying like April 30th is when they're planning on having the next update, I think that's kind of out the window. I know the one article that I mentioned, or I linked in here about them being angry, or no, the first one mentioned that for the entertainment business, that whole like side of it isn't expected to recover for another 18 months from this whole thing. So it's going to be interesting to see how Disney bounces back.
Yep, that's for sure.
Well, anything else you guys want to chime in on or say before we wrap this up? Now that we've put a big downer on the Walt Disney episode.
Oh.
No, I think that was a very important, news article to talk about.
Yeah, for sure.
For sure. Then that's going to do it for us this week. Thanks for joining us again on another episode of the Station 71 podcast. If you like what you heard, be sure to subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts from. If you want to read our show notes or find links to all of our social media, that can be found online at www.station71podcast.com. If you have anything you want to hear us talk about or any ideas for future episodes, be sure to email them to station71podcast@gmail.com. We hope you enjoyed your ride, and we'll see you real soon.
Please stand clear of the doors. Por favor, manténganse alejado de las puertas.